Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Angela Kaida. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. I'm also the scientific director of the Equity Data Commons. So it's my honor this afternoon, to welcome you to our panel today, which is titled, How Can Academic Community Collaborations Help Realize the Power and Promise of Big Data to Address Social Justice Challenges in Canada? And before we begin, I would like to ask Elder Valerie Nicholson to open us this morning in a good way. Val?
Ellen, thank you. Kwe, hello. Oakchala is welcome. I invite you to put your feet on the floor and take a deep breath in and feel the energy of Mother Earth. Ninja Luisi Valerie, the name given to me 4 days after my birth, is the one the eagles watch over. I was gifted the name Nodi Wenda, which means wolf eyes, from my Dene family, and I've been gifted the name Auntie from the Torres Strait Islanders. I am Mi'kmaq, Haida, Roma, and UK Islander descent. I'm a mother and a grandmother. I honor and acknowledge all the ancestral traditional territories, lands, and waters across this great land of ours from coast to coast. And this is where we work, we play, we live, and especially learn from. I acknowledge all elders, present, past, and future. I acknowledge and honor those that walked these lands before us. They were the keepers of the medicines, the keepers of our lands. I acknowledge the unceded ancestral traditional lands and waters of the Coast Salish people, for this is where I'm speaking from, and I connect my mind, body, heart, and spirit. I honor the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam, and all those across this great land, all my relations.
All my relations. Thank you so much, Valerie, for starting us off this way. I feel grounded myself. And so welcome, everybody. I'll ask Tanya to move us to our next slide, where before we get started with this exciting discussion today, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of our panel discussion. So I'll start by saying, Tanya, next slide, please, that our panel this morning has three primary. So let me just share these three with everybody here. The first one is we're here because we want to explore how we might collectively apply the power and promise of advanced data infrastructure, analytics, and visualization to serve social justice challenges in Canada. Our second objective is we want to determine what are the key principles, ethics, opportunities, and risks for developing a community-led and data-driven research agenda to examine and address racial, gender, and other social inequities. And finally, we want to explore what are the building blocks for establishing environments where community organizations and leaders feel safe and heard so that they can engage in meaningful academic community collaboration to help achieve their own goals and missions. And how are we going to do that? So next slide, please. To achieve these objectives today, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We've included here as part of their bio, their Twitter handle, so that you can connect with us during or after this panel today. But first, it's Valerie Nicholson, who's an elder and Indigenous peer researcher with the BC Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS and with AIDS Vancouver here in Vancouver, BC. Next, my honor to introduce Nahed Murad, who is the bilingual research coordinator at the YWCA Canada. Welcome, Nahed. Next, we have Fred Popovich, who's the scientific director of SFU's Big Data Hub and a professor of computing science at SFU. Welcome, Fred. And we have Greg Fergus, who is a member of Parliament and chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board, and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Digital Government. Welcome, Greg. So you can see there's a lot to hear from these amazing panelists. I'm really looking forward to hearing their thoughts. But before we get started, please indulge me. I'd just like to take a few seconds to ground our conversation in some background to what led to the idea for this panel. Next slide, please. So let me start by saying that what we measure matters. And in the absence of robust equity data in Canada, including disaggregated data, The systemic inequities that are faced by key populations and communities across the country are repeatedly rendered invisible in evidence. Community and policy leaders have issued urgent calls to collect, analyze, and mobilize data to inform equity-oriented policies that are aimed at addressing systemic racism and gender and other social inequities. And this data can also be used to highlight community strengths that can be further enhanced through dedicated support. Next slide, please. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that big data infrastructure and data analytic capacity is growing at universities across Canada, but it really remains largely inaccessible to community leaders with equity mandates, and is risking widening the digital divide and the power differentials at hand. And so we determined that not just us, many groups have put forward urgent calls to say that we need an effective pathway for grassroots and social justice organizations to access the power and promise of advanced data analytics to address social justice challenges. And we need ways to connect academic and community collaborations to identify these new avenues for realizing or bringing forward new ideas, some innovation in research priorities, how we're going to do data collection, how we're going to facilitate access to data, how we're going to do new analyses, and how are we going to pursue training opportunities where we can collectively harness the potential of this infrastructure to address priorities of equity deserving groups. Next slide, please. And here's where SFU's Equity Data Commons initiative really sits. The initiative aims to work with community organizations and leaders to create a national community academic data partnership hub. And in doing so, to provide access to resources, expertise, infrastructure that's needed to support community-driven data priority setting as a first priority. Also to support the collection, analysis, and visualization of this disaggregated data. And of course, once we have the data, this is not where we have to rest. It's about how are we going to use this disaggregated data in safe, ethical, responsible ways to inform social justice and equity initiatives across the country. And of course, a commitment to training and capacity building in data collection, analysis, and interpretation. Next slide. And just to really emphasize that we've kind of come to this initiative, this Equity Data Commons initiative at SFU, because it builds on so many of the strengths that have been invested in over several years, including the Big Data Hub, which is a core facility at SFU, extensive data stewardship expertise, several faculty, staff, courses that are focused community engaged research, and several strong and existing partnerships with community groups, and hosting the Federated Research Data Repository. And of course, in the context of EDI, or Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, we have an institutional commitment to EDI led by our president, Dr. Joy Johnson. And so finally, on this next background slide, to say that we're really aiming to bring people together to have these conversations across disciplines, across expertise, and across goals, across different goals. And here we can bring together big data, AI expertise, research community expertise, community-based organizations, government representatives, and decision makers, and actually really all who are committed to equity and social justice. And now to move into our panel, we have 4 such representatives here with us on the panel today. So if I can ask for our panelists to join on the stage. Let's see, not sure exactly how that works. Here we are. You can see all of these beautiful people on the stage. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you. So as you know, as part of our conversation today, we're going to function as a panel. Let's pretend, that like Oprah's here, we're on a stage and we're sitting on couches, and let's sit into that space. And I'm going to start with a question that I'm going to direct to Val. And I'll give each of you a few minutes to share your reflections on each of your questions. At the end, I'll open it up back to the panel in case somebody has said something that you want to further, follow up on, or maybe even disagree with. And at that point, I will ask us to pause as a panel, and we'll turn it over to the audience, and we'll take audience questions and comments. So everybody, is that okay for everyone? Yes? Okay, great. So Val, let me start with you. Our first question. So you've got extensive experience as a member and a leader of community academic research partnerships, including with and for Indigenous people. So can you let us know what is needed to build equitable and engaged community academic partnerships?
Thank you, Angela. That is a question that I've been thinking about since you gave it to me, and I don't know if I can do it justice, but I'll do my best. First of all, my education is the living experience and the lived. And I think as I was thinking about this question, I went back to my roots and to the teachings that my grandfather gave me. And I think that is a great foundation, I think, that we all need to start with. And with love, that we do this work with love. And to remember who we're doing this research with or on. And to remember that there's a voice and a person behind the data. And to remember that humanity. And to be very respectful in how we present it back to community. We need to do this work with humility. Humility comes to realize that if it wasn't for that, what we're researching, we wouldn't be doing the work that we're doing. To do it with truth, like to really know the truth behind it and to know our own truths and to put our biases away from us. Honesty. I'm just thinking that we need to be honest in our work and to build these relationships. And when we think of the journey that Indigenous people have had since we have been here and with colonization, and we need to build on all of these foundations, but especially honesty. I don't want to be a token in this work, and I have been tokenized. And when we're working with we have to be honest with ourselves and to share a bit of ourselves with those that we're working with. One of our other teachings is wisdom. And we all carry our own wisdoms. And we could go back to two-eyed seeing, where I see the world through my Indigenous lens and the teachings I had. And now I'm seeing it through also a research lens and in community partnerships and work, and how do we blend those together? And we all carry our own wisdoms, and we need to share those and open up about them. And we need to do this with a lot of respect, and knowing that my teachings and words may be different from those of the academia world, and how do we blend these together? But most of all, I think we have to, first of all, respect the lands that we're on, and to acknowledge that there was teachings here before us, and to acknowledge those people or peoples, and to build on that. And our seventh teaching is courage. And it does take courage to make change. It took courage for me to enter this world of academia and of research, but also to remember that I'm a member of community and that I'm always in community. And community has expectations when they see me, like, what have you done with my words? What have you done with my research? And I have to answer to that. And so that is the foundation of the word that I want to come to, is trust. Is we all need to build trust with each other, and especially with community. For our words and actions can cause community damage, or they can cause great community wealth of information and just great strives for wonderful work together. And to educate. And I think one of the great partnerships that I see is, I ask myself, when I'm doing my work, who do I have in my circle of work that is from the community that we're working with or on, especially with community research. And especially for Indigenous peoples, we've been tokenized, we've been used, and it should be a circle, equal partnership. We all have a powerful voice, and to share that voice in a circular manner. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Val. Can I ask you one follow-up question? Can you tell us a bit about what interesting? No. Can you tell us a bit about what, your journey to research? So how,
Sure.
you have been involved in research for the last several years, and you mentioned, coming into research, and I wondered if you could share a bit more.
Thank you. So my journey into research, um, I live near the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is the most impoverished community in Canada. And a lot of people come in here to do research because we tick a lot of boxes, Indigenous, drug users or partakers. We might be houseless, food insecure. So a lot of people come down into our area to do research. We call them drive-bys because they drive in, they gather the research, and we never see them again. I was a participant in many of these surveys, and not knowing who they were, I did a smoking one and I didn't even smoke. I just wanted that $20, and they didn't care about us. So why should I care about their research? Which, sorry that I have to say that. And then I was approached to do a national food security study. And I looked at the survey and it was, how often do you abuse drugs? And I went, whoa, you're not coming into my community and asking that question. I used to use drugs to the best of my ability every day when I was living down there. So why are you labeling me as an abuser? So I started changing language. I also was mother to child transmission for HIV. And I thought, why are you saying that? Why are you giving a label to a woman who is, wanting to be a life giver? She's living with HIV. She has so much on her plate. And all of a sudden you accuse or say to her, mother to child transmission. Like, why can't we have softer, more respectful words like vertical transmission or in vitro? So I decided to become a word change warrior and making surveys so that respectful in community. And as I said, I live in community. So, if I am saying, how often do you abuse drugs? You can imagine what the people would think of me or say to me in the future. And from there, I just really love gathering data. And being respectful in community and bring it back to community. So that started my journey. And I was never going to go and, be the analyst or doing coding or writing papers, because to me, that was a really different, as I used to say, the dark side. But I'm fully there now. I am enjoying research because it is respectful. It involves community in the work that I do. If it doesn't involve, I won't be a part of it. So I really love that research is growing with community, involving community to more, bringing us to conferences, and really respectful of language. Thank you for letting me share on my relations.
Thank you so much, Val. And I think that experience, that the on the ground, literally experience of engaging in these partnerships, they're both their potential and are really important for us to consider as we continue this conversation. So thank you so much. I'm going to move now to a next question for Nahed. Nahed, there have been reports from human rights groups from across the country that have called for the ethical use of disaggregated data to address social inequities. Now, I wanted to ask you, in your role and experience in engaging in research from the National Office of the YWCA, what do you see are the key opportunities, challenges to advancing ethical and responsible governance of disaggregated data? And by governance, I'll include in that, data collection, data sharing, access, safety, sovereignty. And it's a big question, but I think we got to think big. So what are your thoughts?
Well, first, hello, and thank you to the organizers for another great panel discussion on a topic that should never end until we have an answer to it. Allow me first to begin by acknowledging my space and my gratitudes. I'm the first generation Canadian of refugees from war-torn Lebanon. I have, however, had the privilege of sheltering, living, benefiting from the migration of said parents. Uh, Two monolingual Arabic lived experienced persons with absolutely no literacy in their in their mother tongue. Uh, and their struggle to this day is what has allowed me specifically to, and my 9 siblings, to access the rights I would not have been guaranteed in their homeland. Which brings me then now to my land acknowledgement. And I know that it sounds unlike the traditional acknowledgements, but it's my most genuine and true. So first, allow me to express my sincerest gratitude to the indigenous populations of this land for allowing my people to exist in your, inshallah, soon to be reclaimed land, for allowing me the space to grow, to live, and to prosper, and for, well, let's face it, benefit every day. Allow me to simultaneously express my regret and my sincerest apologies for these exact same facts. My parents, much like most refugees, were fleeing the effects of their colonized world. I, however, am a child of this land and should have known better. And for that, I sincerely regret allowing myself to be intentionally misinformed, misled, misguided, and potentially fall in the trap of further traumatizing what can only be to me a sister community. In both my academic as well as my current advocacy praxis, not practice, my commitments lie in true and full decolonization of this apartheid we all live. More than a decade and a half ago, as I interacted with the Canadian healthcare system for my then ailing 4-year-old son of brown skin, Arab name, Muslim adherence, I came to realize the fragility of his Arab brown skin in this world, the disposability of his body to the system. A fragility that had gone unbeknownst to me, an able-bodied woman of color, having so very well perfected the mastery of living amongst the colonizers. In hindsight, it was always there. Trained as a computational sociolinguist, I dedicated my career in academia to the understanding of the effects of linguistic oppression, specifically on Native populations by any colonizer, particularly the plight of women and the fragility of their bodies in said situations. Now at the YWCA, I work on creating research paradigms for social advocacy, as in collect, analyze, publish on current social issues and concerns. Recently, we conducted a pan-Canadian survey on the effects of gender-based violence in Canada in collaboration with more than 70 local NPOs, NGOs, and community-led service providers. We did so to provide WAGE, a national action plan on gender-based violence. We also conducted a distinct, separate annex of GBV that forefronts the calls of Indigenous survivors, as their plight is one specifically of colonization and must always be framed as such. Key to this talk today is how do we govern, house, and give back to these communities? Well, I'll try to answer it all at once. How do we really govern it? Any data collected by the YWCA members, and I will forefront that by saying that our research team is a pilot 1 year old. So we started this a year ago. With the idea of this, how do we deal with entering a knowledge-based world, a knowledge-based economy, and every vulnerable population missing out on every access to an infrastructure. So this data is available to the research team through the server, and we analyze it freely, if and only if it was collected from YWCA member associations. Any consults made by our research team with any other organization is also housed and governed by the WISE National Member Services team. When the research team requires data sets, we make a request to the member services team with a project proposal. The member services team will then seek approval from the organizations or the community-led participators The communications team, which is another team, has a large network, and it engages in many partnerships also with local organizations to collect sensitive data, and can thus play the same mediator role as the MST in regards to our research team. At the Y, we believe that only the communities from whom we collect the data can and should retain ownership of that data, which means any and all publications, projects, summary reports, and whatever I come up with on a Tuesday afternoon must be approved by the original community. Once the request is approved, we receive the data sets through an internal server housed by the member services team, and we work towards a first deadline of submitting raw files and a draft of a pilot output, whatever that may, of whatever type of file we were asked to do, to the same organization. The reason we keep everything apart through a member services team is to create neutrality in our research team. As lead, neither I nor any of my researchers are ever engaged in any way with these organizations. We provide the coding interview protocols, we train, we do everything necessary, and we pay from our research budget to have community participants lead community focus interviews. I'm also not engaged in the advocacy in any way. So the community will then usually provide us with editing requests. Usually that's what's happened, corrections. And it may happen, it hasn't yet, that we are asked to do complete redos. And we are absolutely happy to redo. At the Y, we acknowledge that the communities we are seeking are the experts on the subject matter we are studying, which means if we did not deliver a reasonable outcome, we missed the point. It was us who failed to communicate, and not the participants who failed to communicate to us their needs. If or when that happens, we have a protocol in place. We keep a research budget of about 10 to 15 hours a week of a hire of any given week for a community member of the community's choice to join our team and lead our research action labs, also known as our brainstorming sessions for research questions and coding protocols. Our limitations. As an NPO, even as one of the largest NPOs in Canada, we don't have money. We lack cash resources to compensate the communities of participants meaningfully and gainfully. This, however, we hope is mitigated by the heavy campaigning and advocacy and hours spent by the YWCA teams based on our research is enough. Knowing that, we are in a panel today to see how we can make the world that profits from the most vulnerable communities, the academics, do better. We can do better, and we can do it together. The models of compensation that the YWCA would like to adopt are aligned more with leaving behind fully trained, resourced community members that can own and use and derive their own research questions from their own data. Collaborations with advocacy groups, NPOs, through your large grants are key to ensuring we all get this done. We have the networks and the trust from the communities and the support from the NGOs, and the academics have the cash. So partnerships are the only way. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt you. I didn't know you were so close to the end. Thank you so much for those reflections, and also for outlining some really practical considerations. So sort of like the big picture kind of structural stuff that we need to grapple with, but as well as some really practical considerations as well. So thank you so much for that. And I think you've actually set up my colleague, Fred Popovich, very well. What do you think, Fred?
I think it's a wonderful setup, yes.
Okay, great. And so let me ask you then, as the scientific director of SFU's Big Data Initiative, your team leverages the power of big data so Canada can lead in a digital world. So what do you see are the key opportunities and key challenges to stimulating innovation? How are we going to pursue meaningful data analyses and visualization that leverages these partnerships and uses advanced analytics to examine, expose, and address inequities?
Okay, that's a great question, which I could probably lecture for 3 hours on. You'll be pleased to know I won't be lecturing for 3 hours on this. And it was just ideal that so much of this was set up so nicely by Val and by NIAID in terms of what we're going to be the way of dealing with this. So I just want to focus on a couple of things relating to opportunity and to challenge. And particularly with respect to opportunity, that notion that Naya just talked about is partnership is the key way of doing this. And at the Big Data Hub, basically it is all about a collaborative environment, whether that environment be physically there on the traditional terraces of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, or whether it be in this virtual world, the way that we're now able to connect, from all across Canada, and likely people from around the world are being able to join us as well. And so having the notion of collaboration and partnership, it's clearly, for partnerships, it's more than just tools and more than just data. It's the people, it's the processes, and the model that we have is exactly what we were hearing just a moment ago of what you're able to succeed is by bringing together, whether it be the people with data, the people that have the problems, the people that have the expertise, the people that have, we can learn, build on the work of others. It's building with that community. So we work not just with the institutes inside the university and the academics inside the university, it's working with our staff, working with, building the relationships in the external community with not only with our existing students, but with former students, with organizations, with governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations. It's the range of things. And innovation can come from that approach. And given that we're in the context of, your question was in terms of the stimulating innovation in terms of data, all things data, I guess the one piece I would want to tell everybody to pick up on is the opportunity of storytelling for being able to basically answer some of our difficult problems. It's not just, think of it, a story is a process. Things are revealed as you're going along. And that is the way that really we can go from data, not just data, to go from data to information, to knowledge, to wisdom, that pyramid, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid people have talked about so much in the past. And Val mentioned wisdom in her opening comments as well. And with that wisdom and with that process, building the trust that we need to have such successful partnerships. So given that we're trying to, and don't have much time in terms of this, from the making sense of data, there's a lot that can be done with data, and a lot of the things are knowing what questions to ask and knowing what questions are needed. And it's not just inherent in the data itself, it's inherent. We have to talk about the processes. It's making sense of using a combination of not only analytical techniques, but in our terms of our processes, but even different ways of thinking. And my colleagues that are doing work in visual analytics say the importance of visual thinking. And even this past week, when I was teaching a course, the basics of data science, talking about the importance of storyboarding in terms of getting the information and the knowledge across that needs to be done in order to solve some of the difficult problems we're dealing with. So we can get what we've been able to do, and researchers and practitioners around the world are able to do, is really have what my colleague referred to as a structured approach of generating questions and gathering evidence based on this notion of iteration or refinement. So it's not just a straightforward process. It's a cyclical process of a pipeline of things that is filled with a lot of choices. Like the question, like for instance, some of the things that come to my mind is like on a data-driven approach, what questions does your data suggest to you? What did you inherently want to explore, but after starting to discuss this with your colleagues and by looking at your data, thinking about, okay, are there other things that we need to be starting to consider? Is there other data that we need? How good is our data? So it's not just about getting it's not just good, as my colleagues say, it's not only about getting the data right, it's about getting the right data. And we have to, what we've already heard is you have to determine how you want to be measuring what your outcomes are. What value are you getting? And value is not just financial value, it's societal value. And depending on the problems we're trying to solve, there can be a wide range of things that we can measure to determine value from what we're getting. Now, that where there's great opportunity in bringing together people on these processes. I think there's some of, as I was commenting at the beginning there, probably the biggest challenge is relating to data bias, which we've heard talk about already, which can be, there can be that those biases can be intentional or unintentional. It can be a result in a specific task that you're doing, or it can be basically something that ties in with the whole process that you're been undertaking. So this notion of data bias is something that it's not just something you check at the beginning. Oh, do we have data bias? No, it's something that has to fit into the whole process, because it can come in at any time in what we refer to quite often as our data pipeline. In terms of it can come in, the bias can be there during data collection. Bias can be there in data cleaning, which is an important part of it. There's erroneous data sometime, or is it erroneous data? Are you, by removing a certain record or changing a certain record in the process of cleaning it, what are you actually doing to it? The bias can be there in terms of the way you're integrating data from different sources, or can even be there in terms of the way that you are projecting things, in terms of like how you're visualizing things may bias you to see one thing more than another. So although the notion of the tools and the processes have a great deal of opportunities for us, there is a lot of things we have to be aware of during the whole process. And in terms of this, I would have to say that the most important thing that we have in terms of this challenge is this notion of communication, in terms of it, not just the communication between the people that are doing the work, but your communication to your audience, or to the stakeholders of the people that are going to benefit from the problems, the challenges we're trying to address. You always have to think, what we found in terms of our collaborations, thinking of this as you're going along, going all the way through that data processing pipeline, of what kind of information and knowledge needs to be distilled from the different things that you're looking at. So that basically by examining these bias questions and taking data bias issues and questioning constantly during the process, we're able to, I feel, through these partnerships, basically use those analytic techniques to not only examine our data with exploratory techniques, also expose some of these with our tools and our discussions, expose some of these biases. And once we've exposed these biases, take the first step to try to take a look at how do our processes need to be changed? How do our questions need to be changed to address some of these inequalities?
Thank you so much, Fred. I mean, there's such a nice thread being formed between these three talks, such different, expertise represented already on this panel, such different experience, but really quite fascinating to hear a common thread between your talks around communication. So let me move to our fourth panelist, because this work is really about impact, right? Seeing actual change. So Greg, let me turn it over to you. So in your role as the chair of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, the caucus released this statement calling on all levels of government in Canada to measure the pervasiveness of systemic discrimination through the collection of race-based data. So we've read this incredible statement, and it's something that actually we could put into the chat for listeners while we're here. But I wanted to ask you, what do you see? What are the potential impacts of doing this, of collecting race-based data on informing policy and addressing the challenges at hand in Canada?
Well, thank you very much, Angela. And before I answer, I'd like to acknowledge in my turn my gratitude to be coming to you normally from. I'm the member of Parliament for Hull Aylmer, which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. But today, actually, I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta. So thank you very much for having me be a part of this. And I'm grateful to our Indigenous brothers and sisters upon whom we gather today, upon whose land we gather today. I would want to answer that question in many of the ways, that the same thing that Val has brought up, or Nahed or Fred, this is a total game changer by having disaggregated data and by collecting this kind of data. The reason why I say it's a game changer is because, as someone who, when I got elected and we decided to form the Parliamentary Black Caucus, the reason why we formed it was precisely because the day after the election, I started getting calls from people from not my riding saying, wow, we saw a blackface, a person from my background get elected. This is really important. I pointed it out to my kids, and they were surprised. And then in that election in 2015, there were 5 people of African descent, African Caribbean descent, who were elected to Parliament. And once we got into the House, I would ask the other colleagues, did you guys get the same kind of telephone calls that I got? And they all had the same experience. And so it really shows you that how much representation matters. But then that led us to a whole bunch of questions as to, well, are there policies which are specific to our communities? And some of us who had been more in contact with Black community organizations, quite quickly said yes immediately. They rhymed off a whole bunch of stuff. And then we decided, well, let's form this caucus so we could explore these issues more deeply. And the first thing that we wanted to do is to then find some data what studies, what do they say? How are Blacks being particularly affected by different government policies? And to some of us, it was a real surprise to see that there was really no general data that had been collected. And that was tough, because I think the real rule is, if you can't measure it, you can't change it. If you can't measure it, how can you acknowledge that it even exists? And that's what we were coming up against over and over again. What we had seen was that if there was any disaggregated data that was being collected, it was being collected under the category of visible minorities. But there was a real sense, an intuitive sense, and it's been borne out by research since, is that Black Canadians end up being the invisible part of the visible minority category. So to that regard, it became more and more important as we were when we were seeking out information, as what's happening in our justice system, public safety system, security system, what's happening in our economic policies, what's happening in housing, what's happening on a whole host of issues. How can we try to reach it and see what's happening with Black Canadians as opposed to visible minorities? And we couldn't find the information. Now, there were a number of academics who had been out there working on this file, creating that, I want to say bassin, but I'm trying to think of the English word for it, but creating this base of information. And as we contacted them, we realized, oh, yeah, there are differences. We need to start looking for this. This is why disaggregated data makes is so important, because once you start to measure it, you really can't unsee what you've seen, and so that becomes crucial. I think, though, that Valerie very poignantly pointed out, but also reinforced by Nahed and Fred, is that you just can't depend on the good will of people to interpret the information correctly, or have the assumption that everything is going to be properly interpreted. That's why as Fred just pointed out, I think quite well, the importance of making sure that you're measuring bias throughout the process, not only in the collection of the data, but in the processing of it, in the analysis of it. Valerie pointed out the real importance of making sure that when you're reporting back to the community, that you're working with the community, that data, in a sense, belongs to the community, and it should be, as you are crunching it all out, the community needs to be involved in that process as well, just to make sure that we avoid that bias that almost always can creep in. I think if you do these kind of things, we have a real opportunity to get a truer picture of what's happening. And by getting a truer picture of what's happening, I take it as an article of faith that good people will then want to do something about it, and will want to perhaps redesign our policies, perhaps retarget them, perhaps wholly think about them all from the get-go. And even if you are not so high-minded as to why you should do it for social policy reasons, even if you were just somebody who is more focused about dollars and cents, the argument which I would make is saying, don't you want your dollars to be most efficiently used by government or by whatever organization? And the way to do that is making sure that the policies that you design meet the people in the most effective way. And the only way you can get at that is if you disaggregate the data to see what the differential consequences are of those policies. If we do those kind of things, I think we'd be in a much better place. We'll have much more effective and resilient policies for our country, and that we'd be able to really make extremely important differences to people's lives. And if I could just say one last thing just to conclude, all this, of course, we can save ourselves a lot of grief if we always ask ourselves the question when we are designing these policies, when we are developing them, is that the people who's around the table in the design process, or in other words, if you phrase it the other way, who's not around the table. It makes no sense to design policies that would predominantly affect women without women being present. I think over the last 20 years, we're beginning to understand painfully understand the importance of having Indigenous people around the table. I think we need to go further and making sure that when we're designing policies, we want to have that rich diversity of Canada around the table, to making sure that it's an error check, in a sense, to try to minimize, not eliminate, but minimize those biases when you're actually designing policies. So let me leave it there and look forward to the questions.
Greg, thank you so much. And I appreciate your kind of calling in of all of us. So these initiatives, disaggregated data to understand how different communities might be affected differentially by different policies or different viral infections, for example, are actually about benefiting all of us as a society. And I appreciate that take on our conversation today and so many of your insightful kind of observations. At this point, I do want to give opportunity to our audience. If there are questions that you would like to pose to any of our panelists, please, we're really hoping to hear from you. I understand that you can put the questions into the live Q&A button that is at the bottom of, I think, everybody's screen, definitely my screen. So feel free to enter your questions there. I'm happy to pose them to the panelists on your behalf, or you can use the discussion forum. So we have about, now we've got about seven or 8 minutes for questions. And perhaps while we wait for some of these questions to come in from our audience, let me ask a question back to the panel. So Val, I'm going to come to you because it's hard to be the first panelist because you say your statement and you listen to everybody else's kind of comments. And I wondered if you wanted about particularly the impact, right? So Greg has given us such a great way to think about impact. And I wanted to know if you wanted to follow up on anything there.
Wow, I'd just like to say thank you. I'm in awe. And Fred, if you're a teacher, I want to be in your class. I want to learn more. I think just listening, some things that came to my mind is how words can be so damaging. I brought that up earlier, but how we can actually enrich them when we're talking about it. And when we're talking about participants and gathering that data, we have actually changed that name to community experts because there's so much more than participants. And if it wasn't for community experts, we wouldn't have these knowledges. So I'm just where I work, we actually take a moment to reflect on when we're writing something or bring it back to community, or if we're putting up a poster for CAR or any of these research symposiums. We know community will be listening to our words or hearing it. And how do we make that respectful? So that reminder of why we're doing the work we're doing. And I heard some on ethics, and just going back to how we gather knowledges and respect and understanding of different cultures. In our culture, tobacco ties are a gift that we give because we give something if we're taking something. Like, so if a community expert's giving us information, we gift them with tobacco. And ethics was denied because we were told it was damaging to community. So we actually gave our protocol why tobacco is so important to us, that it is a ceremonial, it's used in a good way, and we were denied ethics again, even though we sent teachings in of our elders. So again, it's just opening up our minds and our eyes that there is so many different perspectives that are coming from the land, and to really honor allyship with our communities. And I love that. Who's missing at the table? I love that. And because if we don't know it's there, you need to find us. So all my relations, thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Val. I'm going to turn to some questions coming in to the live Q&A. And we've got a great question here, very practical actually. So the question says, do you have any tips on how to collect data without potentially harmful labels that may negatively affect community members? And this is a great question, because we do have a sordid legacy of collecting data, applying harmful labels to it, and actually going through a process of extracting that information and ultimately causing harm in that process. So this is not a neutral, value-free space that we're talking about. So maybe Nahed, can I ask you this question? I'll start with you, your thoughts on tips of how to do this in a safe way. Here?
So, sorry. So tips on how to avoid. We take, so our key. I'm a linguist, so I'm specifically like sensitive to it. Our key is no words of ours are ever used. We exclusively take the calls as they are given to us verbatim from the communities, even if they are in a different language. We are in a multilingual society. So we avoid at all cost. And if by that you mean like independent, like how we treat our variables, the work we do is not one of academic nature. So we're not really looking at transposing or figuring out what are the everyday of like, the social determinants of gender-based violence. We leave that to you and we take it straight from your publications. We're more looking at how do the communities on the ground that we serve every day through our member associations report to us barriers and or enablers. So that's, we rely heavily on verbatim the word of our experts, really.
Yeah. And if I can just add something very briefly in terms of that, because that's a whole aspect of data collection, and you talking about relying on your experts. That's the thing that I've even noticed now being on the research ethics board of the university. The more people that are aware, are over taking a look at the study you're planning on doing and how you're planning on collecting your data, there's more opportunity. As long as you have people from a diverse background, these issues you can become aware of them, because it is so easy to, if you have a very small group of people looking at it, you'll miss things. So again, the larger the group of people, and I've noticed this even in our own research ethics board, how broad that board is, and how it functions in terms of people bringing their diverse backgrounds to that table.
Great point, Fred. I think that actually leads very nicely into another question that's come through that's about ways of improving, if you don't mind my I guess ad-libbing around this question, but ways of improving engagement, whether that's hiring or inclusion of different groups, equity deserving groups around within these processes, whether that's about research, whether that's about advocacy, communication, policy impact. What do we need to do better representation? I'd like to talk about like kind of representation, especially because this is an EDI symposium. So we probably have some folks that are already very oriented to the need to do this, but how do we do it? So Greg, is it okay? Can I come to you in your work?
It's so funny. I wanted to jump in there on that one, and I think it gets back to that point that I said. It really is a question as to who's not around the table. Maybe the short answer to the question to the person who asked perfectly. So I don't think there's one particularly. There's no silver bullet that's going to get us with perfect. Non-damaging language which could be used or introduced into a survey or to a study. But if you really just are conscious of the problem, and you're again asking yourself the question, who's not around the table, and when you try to study something, I think that front end work could really help reduce and mitigate the potential of having introducing language or introducing bias which is not desirable. So it'd be I guess if you could set up a process to try to lower that risk, and then just hope that you get it right.
Thanks. I think that's such an honest answer. Honestly, like there's no recipe. I'll share that in our work. I'm a researcher, but in our work, one of the pieces that we've really come to sort of standardize is around compensation. I think a lot of this work relies on almost like volunteerism from equity deserving groups and their expertise and these conversations that does largely go uncompensated. And I think structurally that is something that we must and we actually can change. I think research has been probably a bit, I can only speak to our sector, but we have been slow to that change, but we are developing several guidelines and expectations of, if we are working in community academic partnerships, what are the kind of engagement rules, quote unquote, here, and that we speak really openly and transparently about compensated time and work. So I'll just add that contribution. We have just a couple of minutes left here. I wanted to give our panel, if there's one burning point that you wanted to share before I thank everyone and kind of close us for today. Everybody's nervous to be that person.
I'll be happy to.
Person. Oh, I mean, it's a follow-up to what you said, actually. So if you don't mind it, it's really, I'll hand it back to you. I worry very much when we talk about tables, about ending up with tokens. And I will tell you right now, for my community, I'm a token. I'm by all standards a token. I end up in all the things where they want people to talk about Arab Muslims. And that's fair, but kind of not, because I am not by any standards representative of that community as a whole. So my worry is we're always entrapped. That type of language has been government language for more than 15 years, for as long as I've existed in this world. This who's coming to the table. It's almost aggravating to still kind of hear the same issue, because we end up on these things as the tokens.
I totally hear you on that one, as often being tokenized in my own way, and the great fear of not being representative of look, I'm a member of Parliament. I'm not living the same reality that so many other Black Canadians are living. So I recognize that, but I'm not certain if I see a better way around it. And when I say like who's around the table, that doesn't mean just that one-off. We're going to do a survey, therefore we have to, let's make sure we bring in some consultative body. I'm trying to say that what you want to do is that you want to have people who are working, the people who are designing. That's what I'm talking about, like who's not around the table. So we move not from tokenism, but more to just a fuller understanding. There are social scientists who come from diverse communities, and they're just as qualified as anybody else. They're the ones perhaps who should be hired. There was yesterday the universities across Canada, Universities Canada had launched the Scarborough Charter, which was a way of looking at how can we make sure that we have a greater representation of Black Canadians. But it goes even beyond that. It really is looking at the question as to who's in our academic communities, who's part of faculty, who's in senior leadership. I think these are questions that we really have to get a handle on in the 21st century.
Oh, what a great, okay, there's really not more to add to that, both of those statements. And I will just say, for those of you who've joined us today, if you would love, if we would kind of have you as part of this ongoing conversation, I've put up our contact information here. As I mentioned, we hosted a roundtable back in September to start some of this dialogue. We are drafting a position paper around how Canada can move forward in this space effectively, meaningfully, ethically, responsibly. If you would like to see a draft of the position paper or like to contribute, please do reach out to us. We would be delighted to hear from you. On behalf of myself and our panelists, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.